Snow drifted across the Montana plains like a ghostly curtain, the flakes soft and endless, hiding the land in silence. Inside the weather-beaten farmhouse of the Marrows family, laughter echoed, a cruel, biting kind. The Marrows had 5 daughters, each one a picture of charm and grace save for the youngest, Clara. Her face bore the faint traces of childhood scars, her hair too wild, her figure too modest. Years of ridicule had carved her heart into quietness. She moved like a shadow in her own home, tending to the chores her sisters refused to touch. When the letter arrived from the neighboring rancher, a widower named Luke Halden seeking a wife, the family's wicked amusement found a new shape. They decided to send Clara as a joke. Let's see what the poor fool does when he sees her face. Her eldest sister sneered, clutching the letter. Her mother, weary and cruel in her indifference, only nodded. Clara tried to protest, but her words were brushed aside like dust in the snowstorm. They dressed her in her oldest dress, patched and dull, and tied her hair back with a piece of twine. "You'll make him regret asking," her father laughed, slapping his knee as if it were the finest entertainment. With trembling hands, Clara packed her small satchel, an old Bible, a comb, and her mother's worn handkerchief, and climbed into the wagon. The snow fell thicker now, swallowing the world in white. The journey was long and bitter, the wind slapping her cheeks until they burned. Yet as she rode toward the Halden ranch, her thoughts shifted from humiliation to quiet hope. Maybe, just maybe, this cruel errand would set her free from the house that had never known her worth. At the same time, Luke Halden sat by his frosted window, watching the storm gather. His ranch stretched wide across the valley, but it felt empty without laughter. His wife had died 3 winters ago, leaving him with a quiet ache he carried like a wound. Folks called him kind but lonely. When he'd written to the Marrows, he'd only wanted companionship, someone to share the silence, someone whose heart was steady. He didn't know that the woman coming to him wasn't sent out of love but out of mockery. As the snow piled high and the wind howled like a wounded beast, fate began to weave its thread. For within that wagon, wrapped in shame and trembling with cold, was the woman who would soon thaw the frozen chambers of his soul. By the time Clara's wagon reached the Halden ranch, the world had turned to white silence. The fence posts were buried beneath drifts, the barn roof heavy with snow, and the sky hung low and gray. Her fingers were numb from gripping the reins, her breath a cloud before her face. When she saw the ranch house through the storm, a sturdy timber home with smoke curling from its chimney, her heart pounded not from fear, but from disbelief that anyone could live in such loneliness. As the wagon stopped, she slid down awkwardly, her boots sinking deep into the snow. She stood there, shivering, clutching her satchel, feeling smaller than ever. Then the door opened. A tall figure stepped out, brushing snow from his hat. Luke Halden's first thought wasn't of disappointment, but of surprise. The woman before him looked like she'd walked through a storm of ghosts, hair wind-blown, cheeks red with cold, eyes uncertain yet alive with something fierce. There was no vanity in her, no polished pretense, just honesty and a quiet kind of strength. "You must be Miss Marrow," he said, his voice deep and warm despite the cold. She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. He saw how her hands trembled, how her shoulders drew inward as if expecting ridicule. That simple sight softened him in ways he hadn't expected. "You're frozen," he said gently. "Come inside before you turn to ice." Inside, the fire crackled with life, and Clara stood uncertain at the door, afraid to bring the snow or her shame into such warmth. Luke took her coat, setting it by the hearth, and poured her a cup of coffee so hot the steam fogged her eyes. "I'm sorry for the state I'm in," she whispered, voice small as the storm outside. "My family. They didn't think much of this." Luke tilted his head, catching the quiver in her tone. "Your family doesn't live out here," he said simply. "You do now, and I think that makes all the difference." The storm raged for 3 days, trapping them together in that cabin surrounded by white silence. Clara helped in the kitchen, mending old clothes, keeping the fire strong, though she hardly spoke. Luke watched her quietly. How she moved with care, how she hummed to herself when she thought no one was listening. Something in her presence melted the cold in his chest that no fire had ever reached. When she laughed softly at his old dog's clumsy tricks, Luke realized it was the first sound of joy that had filled the ranch in years. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside, 2 souls began to thaw, one moment of kindness at a time. As the storm quieted and the days stretched into soft white mornings, Luke found himself studying Clara not as a guest, but as the soul of the home he'd long forgotten he needed. She rose before dawn, her breath visible in the chill, lighting the fire and feeding the horses before he even stepped from his room. When she moved through the kitchen, the scent of baked bread and pine smoke lingered, wrapping the cabin in something that felt like peace. Luke often watched from the doorway, silent, his heart both heavy and light. She wasn't the woman the Marrows had likely promised, a beauty to show off or a jewel to boast of, but there was a radiance in her simplicity, a kind of grace that came from pain overcome. One afternoon, as they worked side by side mending the barn fence, Luke noticed her hands, scarred, roughened from years of hard labor. "You've worked a ranch before?" he asked. Clara hesitated, the hammer in her hand trembling slightly. "Not a ranch," she said softly. "A home that never wanted me. My sisters were taught to sew, to dance, to laugh. I was taught to scrub and keep quiet." Her words fell like slow snowflakes, gentle but heavy with sorrow. Luke felt anger rise in his chest, not at her, but at the cruelty that could twist a family so cold. "They were fools," he said finally, his tone fierce in the quiet air. "If they'd seen what I see, they'd have begged your forgiveness." Clara smiled faintly, her eyes downcast. "You don't know me yet, Mr. Halden," she whispered. "If you did, you might not be so kind." He stepped closer then, his voice lower, steadier. "Maybe I don't know your past, but I know the person standing in front of me, and that's the only truth that matters here." For a long moment they stood together in the fading light, the snow glowing blue around them. The horses stirred in their stalls and the world seemed to pause. Something unspoken passed between them, something warmer than words, fragile as breath. Later that night, as the wind moaned outside, Luke sat by the fire while Clara stitched a tear in his old flannel shirt. The light flickered across her face, softening her scars into something almost celestial. "Your hands were made for more than chores," he said quietly. "They were made to build, to heal." Clara didn't answer, but her eyes shone. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, not as a burden, not as a joke, but as a woman worthy of warmth. Outside, the snow glittered under the moonlight like a promise waiting to be kept. When spring's first thaw came, melting the edges of the snow into soft rivers of silver, Luke knew it was time to face what Clara had run from. He saddled his horse and told her he'd be gone for a day, but she sensed the truth in his eyes. He was going to see the Marrows. She tried to stop him, her hands clutching his coat. "Please," she begged softly, "leave it buried. They won't care. They never will." But Luke only laid his hand over hers, rough palm against trembling fingers. "They don't have to care," he said. "But they'll know, and you deserve that much." He rode through the melting drifts until the Marrow farmhouse appeared on the horizon, gray and crooked under a leaden sky. When he dismounted and stepped inside, the laughter hit him like the sting of wind, shallow, sharp, the same kind Clara had described. The Marrows stared at him with wide eyes when he spoke his name. "Luke Halden," he said, voice even as stone. "I came about your daughter." They smirked, expecting ridicule. Has the poor fool realized his mistake? The father chuckled, but Luke didn't flinch. "No," he said, his tone low and unwavering. "I came to thank you for sending me the only woman on this earth who still knows the meaning of kindness." The laughter died. He stepped closer, eyes burning with quiet fury. "You sent her to humiliate her." "To humiliate me?" "But she's built my home into a place worth living again. She's the strongest soul I've ever known, and if you can't see that, then it's not her who should feel shame, it's you." For the first time, the Marrow house fell silent. The eldest sister lowered her gaze, the mother looked away, and the father's smirk cracked like thin ice. Luke turned to leave, his boots echoing across the wooden floor. "Clara will never come back here," he said before mounting his horse. "She has a home now, and a name that's spoken with respect." When Luke returned that evening, the ranch glowed with firelight against the snow. Clara stood outside waiting, her hair loose and shining under the moon. "You went, didn't you?" she whispered, tears glimmering in her eyes. He nodded. "I told them the truth. The rest doesn't matter." She pressed a hand to her mouth, her shoulders shaking as if a lifetime of chains had finally broken. Luke reached out, pulling her into his arms, feeling the tremor of her relief, the warmth of her heartbeat through the cold. "You don't belong to their cruelty anymore," he murmured. "You belong where you're loved." And for the first time, Clara allowed herself to believe it. Winter returned a year later, soft and pure, draping the valley in shimmering white. The Halden Ranch no longer looked lonely. It breathed with life. Smoke curled gently from the chimney, horses stamped in the frosted corral, and laughter spilled from the windows like music. Inside, Clara stood near the hearth, her face flushed with warmth, her hands kneading dough while Luke stacked firewood by the door. The room smelled of pine, bread, and quiet joy. Outside, snowflakes danced in lazy spirals, coating everything in silver light. She looked out through the frosted glass, remembering that first storm, the bitter road that had carried her to this place. And she smiled. The woman who had once been sent away as a cruel joke now stood as the heart of a home, beloved, respected, and free. Luke came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Thinking about the past again?" he murmured against her hair. She nodded softly. "I was thinking how the snow used to make me feel so small. But now..." She turned in his arms, meeting his eyes that gleamed like morning over fresh snow. "Now it feels like the world is starting over every time it falls." Luke smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Maybe it is," he said. "Every snowflake's a second chance." They stood in silence for a long moment, listening to the wind hum against the eaves. In that quiet, every wound seemed to have found its healing. When evening came, the two of them stepped outside hand in hand, watching the flakes gather at their feet. The mountains glowed pale blue beneath the moon, and the world felt endless and kind. Luke reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small ring he'd fashioned from a silver horseshoe nail. Simple, strong, unbreakable. "I should have asked you long ago," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Clara Marrow will you be Clara Halden before the next snow melts?" Her eyes filled with tears that sparkled like frost. "I already am," she whispered. He slid the ring onto her finger and she pressed her forehead against his chest as the snow fell around them, soft, endless, forgiving. That night, as the fire glowed and the wind sighed across the plains, Luke and Clara sat wrapped in a quilt, watching the snow swirl outside. There was no laughter of mockery now, only the sound of peace. The cruel joke that had once sent her away had become the story of how two broken souls found warmth in a frozen world. And when the dawn rose over the white fields, painting the land in gold, Clara smiled through the window and whispered, "Let it snow," for every flake that touched the earth was proof that even in the coldest places, love could bloom. And it had right there, in the heart of Montana.